HY everyone, welcome to the channel. There's a moment in every conflict when uncertainty becomes more dangerous than the weapons themselves, when what is unknown begins to shape decisions just as much as what is confirmed. That moment has arrived, and it is unfolding not through explosions or official statements, but through silence. A silence so precise, so controlled, that it is now driving the entire narrative of this crisis. Because right now, there is one question that no government, no intelligence agency, and no global leader has been able to answer with certainty. Where is the Israeli Prime Minister? This is not speculation for dramatic effect. This is not a rhetorical hook designed to hold attention. This is the central point around which everything is now revolving. Because a claim has been made, and it was not a small claim, not a vague suggestion, not an ambiguous statement designed to create confusion. It was direct, it was calculated, and it was delivered with the kind of clarity that forces every intelligence service in the world to stop and pay attention. The claim was that missiles struck the office of the Israeli Prime Minister, not a military base, not a storage facility, not an air defense system, the office itself, the physical center of executive power during an active war. And then came the silence, not the kind of silence that governments use to manage headlines, not the kind that follows routine operations where timing and messaging are carefully controlled. This is different. This is total. No clear time-stamped confirmation, no visual proof, no direct public appearance that closes the loop and restores certainty. Just a vacuum. And in war, a vacuum is never empty. It fills immediately, and what fills it right now is a narrative that is spreading faster than any official response could contain. Every hour that passes without confirmation is not neutral. It is active. It shifts perception. It creates pressure. It allows one version of events to expand while the other remains unspoken. And that matters more than anything else at this stage. Because in modern conflict, perception is not secondary to reality. It is part of reality. Decisions are made based on what leaders believe to be true, not just what is proven. Markets react to uncertainty. Allies adjust their posture. Adversaries amplify the doubt. And the doubt is growing. What makes this moment especially volatile is not just the claim itself, but the context in which it arrives. This is not happening in isolation. It is happening in the middle of an already escalating conflict, where every move is being watched, measured, and interpreted for its deeper meaning. The strike, or the claimed strike, lands differently because of what has come before it. Previous statements from the same source have not been empty. They have often aligned, at least partially, with real events. That pattern changes how this claim is received. It forces analysts to take it seriously, even without confirmation. But here is where precision matters. There is a line between what is known and what is not known, and that line must be protected. What is known is that a statement was issued claiming a strike on a highly sensitive location. What is known is that information flow from inside Israel has been tightly restricted under wartime conditions. What is known is that there has been no definitive public confirmation that resolves the question completely. That is the reality as it stands. What is not known is everything that matters most: the condition of the Prime Minister, the actual level of damage, if any, the reason behind the silence, whether it is strategic, temporary, or something more serious. That gap between confirmed facts and unanswered questions is where the entire story now lives. And it is exactly where pressure builds. Because this is not just about one individual. It is about decision making. It is about command structure. It is about whether the person who has been directing the course of this conflict is still fully in control of it. And that uncertainty does something powerful. It destabilizes assumptions. It forces allies to reconsider timelines. It forces adversaries to calculate opportunities. And perhaps most importantly, it sends a message that does not require confirmation to be effective, a message that says no position is beyond reach, that leadership itself is now part of the battlefield, that the invisible lines that once separated political authority from direct targeting may no longer hold. Even if nothing has changed physically, the perception that it might have changed is enough to alter behavior. That message travels far beyond one country. It reaches every capital watching this conflict unfold. It reaches every leader who understands what it means if that line has truly been crossed. Because if it can happen here, it can happen elsewhere. And once that idea takes hold, it cannot be easily reversed. But the most dangerous part is not the claim, it is what follows it. The silence is not just a lack of information. It is a space where pressure accumulates, where speculation becomes influence, where narratives compete without resolution. Every minute that passes without clarity increases the weight of that silence, and eventually that weight begins to force movement, political movement, military movement, strategic movement. That is where things begin to shift, because while the public sees uncertainty, governments cannot afford to wait for perfect information. They have to act based on probability, not certainty. And when probability is shaped by an unanswered question this significant, the risk of miscalculation rises sharply. Decisions made in this environment are not clean. They are reactive. They are influenced by incomplete data. And that is how conflicts escalate beyond control. Right now, the world is not reacting to a confirmed event. It is reacting to the possibility of one. And that distinction is critical. Because possibility can be more dangerous than reality when it is left unaddressed. The silence continues, and with every passing hour, it becomes less of a pause and more of a force that is beginning to reshape the conflict itself. That force does not remain contained within a single question for long. It spreads, and as it spreads, it begins to expose fractures that were already there but not yet visible. Because beneath the surface of this conflict, there has always been a deeper tension, one that is now coming into full view. And it is not a tension between enemies, it is a tension between allies. What is unfolding is not simply a military confrontation. It is a clash between two completely different strategic visions of how this war should end. On one side, there is a clear priority emerging from Washington, and that priority is not escalation. It is not expansion. It is not total victory in the traditional sense. It is exit, a controlled, managed, politically survivable exit from a conflict that is already producing consequences far beyond the battlefield, because the impact is no longer contained. Energy markets are reacting. Shipping routes are under pressure. Financial systems are adjusting in real time to a situation that has no clear timeline. Every additional day of instability carries a cost, and that cost is not theoretical. It is measured in rising prices, disrupted trade, and growing political pressure across multiple countries. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to contain those effects. From Washington's perspective, the objective is becoming increasingly clear. Stabilize the situation, prevent further escalation, create a pathway toward de-escalation that can be presented as a strategic outcome, not a retreat. That requires something very specific. It requires predictability. It requires a partner on the other side who can make decisions and enforce them. It requires a conflict that is moving toward a conclusion, not expanding into new phases. But that is not the only vision in play. Because from Jerusalem, the calculation looks very different. The logic driving decisions there is not centered on exit. It is centered on opportunity. The belief that the current moment represents a rare window, a set of conditions that may not exist again in the near future. A window where military pressure is at its peak, where capabilities have been disrupted, where the balance of power is temporarily shifted. And in that kind of moment, the instinct is not to step back. It is to push forward, to go further than before, to target not just immediate threats, but the infrastructure that supports them, to reduce long-term risk by acting decisively while the opportunity exists. Because from that perspective, waiting carries its own danger. Waiting allows recovery. Waiting allows adaptation. Waiting closes the window that has just opened. This is not a disagreement about timing. It is a disagreement about the entire direction of the conflict. One side sees continuation as risk. The other sees restraint as risk. And that difference is now becoming impossible to hide. The signs are already there, signals that something is shifting beneath the surface, planned movements that do not happen, meetings that are quietly canceled, communication channels that begin to change in tone and frequency. These are not random events. They are indicators that coordination is becoming more difficult, that alignment is no longer automatic. Because when two strategic visions begin to move apart, the first thing that breaks is synchronization. And in a conflict like this, synchronization is everything. Without it, decisions that were once coordinated become isolated. Actions that were once part of a shared plan begin to diverge. And when that happens, the risk is not just misalignment. The risk is contradiction. One side moving toward de-escalation while the other moves toward expansion. One side trying to stabilize while the other intensifies. That is how situations spiral. Now place the original question back into this context. Because uncertainty at the top of leadership does not just create a gap, it amplifies every existing fracture. If there is even a possibility that decision-making is disrupted, even temporarily, then every disagreement becomes more dangerous. Every difference in strategy becomes harder to manage, because there is no single point of authority to reconcile them in real time. And that creates pressure. Pressure on institutions, pressure on advisors, pressure on those who are still in position to influence what happens next. Because in the absence of clear leadership signals, decisions begin to shift downward. And when decisions shift downward in a high-stakes environment, they become faster, more reactive, and often less coordinated. That is exactly the kind of environment where escalation becomes more likely. At the same time, external actors are watching closely, not just observing, but calculating. Because a fracture between allies is not just a weakness, it is an opportunity to widen the gap, to increase pressure at exactly the points where coordination is weakest. And that is where strategy moves beyond the battlefield. Because this is no longer just about physical strikes or military targets. It is about timing, perception, and leverage. About understanding when the system is under maximum strain and applying pressure at that exact moment. The claim that triggered this entire sequence did not happen randomly. It landed at a moment when alignment was already under stress, when strategic visions were already diverging, when the cost of continuation was already rising. And now those factors are converging. The uncertainty at the top, the disagreement beneath the surface, the external pressure being applied. All of it is coming together in a way that makes the next phase of this conflict extremely difficult to predict. Because prediction requires stability. It requires clear signals. It requires leadership that is visible, active, and confirmed. Right now, none of those conditions fully exist. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Not just because of what may have happened, but because of what might happen next. Because when uncertainty meets strategic division, the outcome is rarely controlled. It is accelerated. Acceleration in a conflict like this does not happen evenly. It builds in layers, each one adding pressure to the next, until the system itself begins to strain under the weight of its own momentum. And right now, one of the most powerful layers driving that acceleration is not military, it is economic. Because while missiles capture attention, markets absorb consequences, and those consequences are beginning to spread far beyond the battlefield. The first place this becomes visible is energy, not in headlines but in movement. Subtle at first, then increasingly sharp. Shipping disruptions, insurance costs rising, supply routes becoming uncertain. These are not isolated issues. They connect directly to the global flow of oil, and when that flow is even partially disrupted, the effects ripple outward immediately. Prices react, and when prices react, governments feel it. Not in theory, but in real political pressure from populations that experience those changes directly. Every day that instability continues, that pressure grows. It does not reset overnight. It accumulates, and accumulation changes behavior. Leaders who might otherwise tolerate a prolonged conflict begin to reassess. Strategies that seemed sustainable a week ago start to look risky, because the cost is no longer abstract. It is measurable, visible, and increasingly difficult to manage. This is where the timeline begins to matter, because conflicts are not only defined by what happens, but by how long they continue. A short disruption can be absorbed. A prolonged one reshapes expectations. And right now there is no clear endpoint, no signal that the situation is stabilizing. Only indicators that it is becoming more complex. Financial institutions are already adjusting their models, not because they know what will happen, but because they cannot assume stability anymore. That shift alone is enough to influence decisions across industries. Investment slows, risk calculations change, long-term planning becomes cautious, sometimes frozen entirely. And that hesitation feeds back into the system, because when economic activity slows in response to uncertainty, it reinforces the perception that the situation is deteriorating. That perception then influences political decision-making, creating a loop where uncertainty drives caution, and caution reinforces uncertainty. Now layer that onto the strategic divide already in place. One side needs this loop to stop, needs prices to stabilize, needs markets to regain confidence, because without that, the cost of continuing becomes politically unsustainable. The pressure is not just external, it becomes internal. It reaches decision makers through multiple channels, from economic advisors to political stakeholders, all pointing toward the same conclusion. This cannot continue indefinitely. The other side sees the same loop differently, sees the rising pressure not as a problem, but as leverage. Because if the cost of continuation increases for everyone else, then holding position becomes an advantage. Endurance becomes a strategy. Not rushing toward resolution, but allowing the system to strain until others are forced to adjust. This is where the conflict shifts from direct confrontation to strategic endurance. It becomes a test of who can absorb more pressure for longer, not just militarily, but economically and politically. And in that kind of test, perception matters as much as capability. The belief that one side can hold longer influences how the other side acts. It changes timelines. It alters decisions that might otherwise be taken quickly. Now return to the central uncertainty. Because in a situation defined by endurance, leadership stability is critical. The ability to maintain a consistent strategy over time depends on a clear decision-making structure. If that structure is even temporarily in question, the entire approach becomes less predictable. And unpredictability, in a system already under stress, increases risk dramatically. Allies need clarity to coordinate. Markets need clarity to stabilize. Even adversaries need clarity to calculate their next move accurately. Without it, every action becomes a guess. And when decisions are based on guesses instead of confirmed information, the margin for error disappears. That is what makes this moment different. It is not just the accumulation of pressure, it is the absence of a clear center holding everything together. A conflict that is accelerating economically, dividing strategically, and now destabilized at the level of leadership perception. And into that environment, time becomes a critical factor. The vacuum expands, the fractures widen, the pressure continues to build without a release point. And when pressure builds without release, it does not remain contained. It forces outcomes, not always the ones intended, and rarely the ones fully controlled. That is where this is heading now, toward a point where decisions will no longer be shaped by what is confirmed, but by what cannot be ignored. And that is where the real danger begins. And this is where everything converges. Because what began as a single unanswered question is no longer just about one leader, one claim, or one moment. It has evolved into something far more consequential, a test of control, of coordination, and ultimately of how this conflict will end. Not in theory, not in distant projections, but in decisions that are about to be made in real time. Right now, there are only a few possible paths forward, and each one carries its own set of consequences. The first is clarity, a definitive, undeniable confirmation that restores certainty at the highest level of leadership. That kind of confirmation does more than answer a question. It stabilizes the system. It reassures allies. It removes the vacuum that has been shaping perception. And most importantly, it reestablishes a clear chain of command at a moment when coordination is critical. If that happens quickly, the trajectory of this conflict could shift, not necessarily toward immediate resolution, but toward controlled movement, toward a situation where strategy can once again be guided by deliberate decisions instead of reactive calculations, where alignment between allies, even if imperfect, becomes possible again. But there is another path, delay. Not absence of information, but prolonged ambiguity, statements that do not fully resolve the question, appearances that raise as many doubts as they answer, signals that are interpreted differently by different audiences. In that scenario, the vacuum does not close, it stretches. And as it stretches, it continues to shape behavior in ways that are difficult to reverse. Then there is the third path, confirmation that changes everything. A scenario where the uncertainty is resolved, but not in a way that restores stability. A scenario where the answer itself introduces a new set of questions about leadership continuity, about strategic direction, about whether the original approach to this conflict can continue in its current form. That kind of confirmation does not close the story. It opens a new phase. Because in that moment, the focus shifts immediately from what happened to what comes next. Who is making decisions? What direction those decisions will take? Whether the existing strategy will be maintained, adjusted, or completely replaced. And that is where the stakes reach their highest point. Because the direction chosen in that moment will not just influence the immediate conflict, it will shape the broader geopolitical landscape that emerges from it. The balance between escalation and restraint, between continuation and resolution, between competing strategies that have been building beneath the surface and are now on the verge of defining the outcome. At the same time, external pressure does not pause. Markets will continue to react. Energy systems will continue to adjust. Political environments in multiple countries will continue to absorb the impact of rising uncertainty and rising costs. None of that waits for clarity. It moves forward regardless, adding urgency to decisions that are already being made under strain. And that urgency narrows the window, because the longer it takes to establish a clear direction, the fewer options remain available. Paths that might have been viable earlier begin to close, not because they are impossible, but because the conditions required to pursue them no longer exist. Timing, in this kind of situation, is not just important, it is decisive. That is why the next phase will not be defined by what has already happened, but by how quickly and how clearly the situation is addressed. Whether the vacuum is closed or allowed to expand. Whether alignment is restored or continues to fracture. Whether the pressure that has been building is released or pushed further to the point where it forces an outcome. And that outcome, whatever it is, will not be shaped in isolation. It will be shaped by every actor involved, by every decision made under uncertainty, by every calculation about risk, cost, and opportunity, by every response to a situation that no longer fits within predictable boundaries. This is no longer a contained conflict. It is a system under stress, approaching a point where small changes can produce disproportionate effects, where a single confirmation, a single decision, a single shift in strategy can redirect the entire trajectory. And that is why this moment matters. Because right now, the world is not just waiting for an answer, it is adjusting to the possibility that the answer, when it comes, may not bring stability. It may redefine the conflict entirely. And once that happens, there is no returning to what existed before, only moving forward into whatever comes next.